Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 23rd, where we are talking about persuasion. And I also wanted to talk about the first paper. And paper number one, as you know, my papers have rolling deadlines, but our due date, or our identified due date, is the 6th of November, which puts us approximately halfway through the semester. Early papers are always encouraged, and certainly that's not to say that you couldn't submit in a paper after that date, but my hope is that by that date or shortly thereafter you will have submitted in a paper, and your first paper would be addressing one of the early sets of readings of the semester. So that could be The Story of an Hour, which is a short story, and writing about a short story is a very different kind of exercise than writing about a novel. We began with Frankenstein, and now we're moving into persuasion. And your second paper, which would be due at the ending of the semester, will be addressing the later texts in the semester. So the exercise is pretty much similar. 4 to 5 pages, critical paper. 4 to 5 pages is just an approximation. It should be as long as you think it needs to be in order for you to support your particular thesis. And it's a critical paper, so you aren't doing outside research. And what you are doing is you are making sure that you are defending your thesis with use of evidence from the text, which is usually quotation and paraphrase. So I had suggested that you might want to discuss the quote that we had examined in The Cult of True Womanhood, that a girl could be ruined by a book, in the context of one of the texts that you might choose for your paper, but you are free to create your own paper topic as long as you get that paper topic approved by me and it's addressing one of the texts of the semester. And in terms of persuasion, this is a very slow moving text, and it's supposed to be because it's supposed to illustrate just how empty and vacuous the life of the elite, in this instance, the landed gentry, happen to be. And we see this through the eyes of our main character, who happens to be Anne Elliot. But the entire Elliot family serves as a kind of microcosm of their world. And the book is both a satire, it's a critique of this lifestyle, but it's also a romance, which I think was very clever on the part of the author because it could appeal to different demographic groups. So if you aren't necessarily interested in satire or social commentary, you might be interested in the romance piece of the novel. We see the incredible importance of manners and decorum, particularly for this social class. And one of the major messages of the text is about the importance of balance and compromise, something that I'll be talking about further in a few moments. But as I had indicated with persuasion, there are many characters, and they oftentimes have similar names, and they are oftentimes related to one another. And keeping a chart of the characters can be very useful in that respect. So what I've done in the notes below is I've divided up the characters into a kind of chart. I ended up dividing the characters based on gender, but you could divide the characters based on any of a number of qualities. And I started with the male characters with Sir Walter Elliot, and just the fact that he has the title of Sir shows that he has a superiority of class that characters who have the title of Mr. wouldn't necessarily have. We know that he is a widower, and the main question in the novel is, will he remarry? And if so, what is that going to mean in terms of the family name? And more importantly, the estate. What most people don't realize, and this is one of the major conflicts at the beginning of the book, is that this family is experiencing financial difficulties. So even though they have the status of the name, they don't necessarily have the income to support that status. So they're trying to find a way to still maintain their reputations, but also find a way to pay off their debts. And of course, Anne Elliot is much more practical than the family would ever be about the way that they could go about doing that. So Charles Musgrove is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. Now, keep in mind that Sir Walter has just female daughters, which means that it's not clear where the estate will go. It will probably go to the nearest male heir, which would be outside of the direct lineage of the children. And of course, if there's a way for this male heir to find a way to incorporate himself more closely to the Elliot family, that would certainly benefit him in terms of not just status, but more importantly, the possibility of income. So, Charles Musgrove is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. And he had once proposed to Anne, which is basically Mary's sister, or who is Mary's sister. So you can imagine how awkward that might be, that Charles Musgrove thought that Anne was superior and he settled for Mary, and the fact that Mary is a younger daughter and that Anne, while being older, still is unmarried in a time period where it was expected that a female would be married, and if she wasn't married by the age of 30 or so, she was considered to be a spinster. Frederick Wentworth, notice his last name, he went and he found his worth, is one of the major characters to propel the action because he was a former suitor of Anne's, and he's a brother to a Mrs. Croft, and he is single, which means that he is also an eligible bachelor, particularly because he's gone and he went and found his worth by serving in the military, in the Navy. So he's a self-made man in a way that Sir Walter Elliot isn't, because Walter Elliot has inherited wealth, which is part of the messages within the novel, is about the rising middle class, about individuals who earn their way rather than just inherit and profit off of the labors of previous generations. So who will he court and who will he marry? And that's usually the major question in the text. It's about what the unions are going to be and will these be positive matches. And an appropriate match would be considered somebody that is of equal or greater status. Then we are introduced to William Elliot, Esquire. So he's an attorney. He's a cousin in the Elliot family, and he is the heir presumptive. The assumption is that he's going to get the Elliot estate because ultimately, after Sir Walter passes, because he's the nearest male heir. And while he is an attorney, he does not have a title as Sir Walter Elliot does. And he eventually will be courting Anne. Mr. Musgrove is Charles Musgrove's father, and he's married. And what we basically have are a division of ages here, the older individuals who are either married or widowed, and then we've got the younger individuals who are looking for suitable matches. The Admiral Croft, and the title of Admiral denotes that he also is a self-made man in the military, and he's earned his income. Admiral Croft is renting Kellynch Hall from Sir Walter. And of course, Sir Walter's problem, or one of his problems, is what to do with Kellynch Hall, the family home, because he can no longer maintain it financially. So he concocts this scheme so that it will be rented out, but only to the appropriate person, somebody who is of a certain amount of status, but not a higher status than Sir Walter, so that Sir Walter isn't overshadowed. Again, the importance of appearances is why Sir Walter has so many mirrors, for instance. So then we have Captain Harville, and again, this is a military group that's introduced through Frederick Wentworth, Captain Benwick, and it turns out that Captain Harville is married, but Captain Benwick is not. He had a fiancée who died, so now the question is, will he court again? One of the messages in the text is how long is it appropriate to court before marrying, and that, yes, you want to make sure that you have a certain level of financial stability, but you don't want to wait so long so that the window of opportunity passes. And then we have Charles Hayter. He's a Musgrove family cousin, and he's courting Henrietta. Now, this is not at all unusual for cousins to marry so that they can keep birthright and estate within the family. And as we're introduced to the female characters, we're first introduced to Elizabeth Elliot. This is Sir Walter's oldest daughter, and she is not married, which also raises eyebrows. But Sir Walter isn't too concerned about it because Sir Walter is a widower, and basically Elizabeth has taken over many of the duties that Sir Walter's wife would have taken over. So he's quite content with the way things are right now. Anne Elliot is the middle daughter. She's the one who basically serves as narrator and as commentator She is single. The question is, who will ever want to court her, because she's lost her bloom. She's getting to that age where it would seem that nobody would want to pursue her as a suitor. And of course, there's irony here because she's got an older sister that doesn't have a suitor, yet that doesn't seem to raise any eyebrows. Mary Musgrove, again, is the youngest daughter, and she is married. And Lady Russell is a family friend. Lady would be a title, much like Sir would be a title of a particular position in society. She serves as a kind of mother figure to Anne. One of the things we'll see this semester is how oftentimes we're presented with motherless children. I didn't do that deliberately necessarily, but it seems to be a major theme that's running through many of the texts from this particular period. And Lady Russell is not courting, and we had talked a little bit about how it would be more common for a female who was a widow to maintain that status if she had a certain amount of financial security. Note that we're never told that Lady Russell has, for instance, any male children that would be inheriting the estate. Therefore, one assumes that she's financially comfortable enough that she wouldn't need to remarry. Sir Walter, much greater likelihood that he would remarry, regardless of his financial status, just because of the role of wife in this society, which was basically a kind of caretaker. And we know that Mrs. Musgrove is Charles Musgrove's mother. It's one of the ways that Anne is able to expand her world by spending time with her in-laws, who don't necessarily have title. They're Mr. and Mrs., for instance, rather than Lady and Sir. But they are much less pretentious and much more down to earth, which reflects really Anne's sensibilities. Now, the Musgroves, Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove, have children of marrying age. And of course, the major question is, will their daughters marry? When will their daughters marry? And whom will their daughters marry? One is named Louisa Musgrove. She's the daughter of the Musgroves. She's Charles Musgrove's sister. And she's courted by Wentworth at one point in the novel. And of course, there is that theme of jealousy as Anne is watching this courtship. One of the reasons why Wentworth is so attracted to Louisa is because of her strong will, something that Anne wasn't able to exhibit in her youth when she had first dated Wentworth before he went and found his worth, because he hadn't established a certain level of financial stability. She was unable to commit to him in marriage. And it's one of her biggest regrets. She was persuaded, hence the title, not to commit to him by Lady Russell, again, a trusted family friend, not out of ill intent, but in protecting Anne. But now Anne has gotten older, and it doesn't seem as if she has a suitor in sight. So now Anne and perhaps others are beginning to question that, especially because Wentworth has come back quite accomplished and quite wealthy at this particular point in time. Louisa Musgrove has a sister, Henrietta Musgrove, another daughter of the Musgroves, another sister to Charles Musgrove. She's also single, and she's being courted by her cousin, Charles Hayter. Again, not unusual for cousins to be courting or to marry. And if you aren't going to marry somebody with status, or you aren't going to marry somebody with financial resources, then you were probably going to marry somebody with religion. So the idea of marrying a reverend, for instance, would be quite appealing. Mrs. Clay, notice again, no title here. And if you think about the surname Clay, that's something that can be molded, something that's changeable. And that in some ways foreshadows the kind of character that she has, as she doesn't have a lot of honor. And she also seems to be quite fickle. She's the eldest daughter's friend, Elizabeth Elliot's friend. She's the daughter to Mr. Shepherd. Mr. Shepherd is the family attorney. And she is also a widow. And the question is, will Sir Walter court her and ultimately marry her, because she's spending a lot of time at the house because she's Elizabeth's friend? And if Sir Walter does court her, will they have children, and will that mean that there will be a direct male heir? There is a Mrs. Smith that we're introduced to later on in the novel, which happens to be Anne's friend, also a widow. Notice how divorce really wasn't an option during this time period. She's not courting because while she's a widow, she is of ill health and she doesn't have any financial resources, so she doesn't really have anything to offer. Anne is willing to be her friend, and that's the way it's presented in the novel, willing to be, even though she doesn't have, Mrs. Smith doesn't have status, and that shows a certain level of integrity that Anne has. This was her a former schoolmistress, and the idea that the Elliot family would never condescend to spend time with someone like a poor Mrs. Smith, but Anne does, shows a very different attitude about wealth and position in society. There's also Mrs. Croft, who's married to the Admiral Croft. Mrs. Croft is the sister to Wentworth. Notice how everybody's related to one another or connected to one another in one way or another. This is a small community, and ultimately this is a community that didn't necessarily have the transportation resources that we have today. So the world would be very small in effect. And basically, it's Mrs. Croft and the Admiral Croft who rent out Kellynch Hall. And this is the way that we're able to introduce Wentworth back into the picture, because his sister and his brother-in-law are renting out the family home of the Elliot family. So they'll all begin socializing soon. And the idea of the minor characters, where we've got a Viscountess Dalrymple, who's introduced later on in the novel. This is Sir Walter Elliot's relative of a yet higher status. So while Sir Walter is used to being in a position of control, in this particular instance, we see how he can be a little bit kowtowed by somebody who is of greater status than he is. And there's also Mr. Shepherd, whom I had mentioned earlier as the family attorney. You might have noticed that the novel is divided up into two pieces, a volume 1 and a volume 2. And as I had suggested, that the text is a satire and a critique on inherited wealth, and it's also a romance story about Anne in particular. And we're introduced right at the very beginning where Sir Walter Elliot is looking at the Bartonage, which happens to be a volume that talks about family connections. And we're also told about all the mirrors in the house, which illustrate his concern with appearances. The Baron would be the lowest order of British nobility, by the way. And a quote that I wanted to talk about was about Lady Elliot, who has now passed, that she had humored or softened or concealed Sir Walter's failings, and though not the very happiest being in the world herself, had found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach her to life, which I think is very much illustrative of what we were talking about in The Cult of True Womanhood and the role of female at the time period. Lady Elliot has been gone for 13 years, a rather ominous number, 13. And Sir Walter now is in financial difficulty. The assumption is that in part it's because Lady Elliot wasn't there to manage the household finances. And his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, 29, is now the lady of the house. The middle daughter, Anne, 27, is unmarried and, as I said, has lost her bloom, no longer has her physical attractiveness, supposedly. The importance of physical attractiveness, especially for female, especially in terms of relationship, is illustrated here. And then it's the youngest daughter out of the three daughters who happen to be Mary. And she married, quote, merely, unquote, into a respectable family with fortune and money, but not nobility. And of course, the goal is to have both. And Sir Walter is quite anxious about the Navy in particular because it can, quote, bring persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, unquote. So Sir Walter is very much grasping onto the old ideology of old family money and status. But we see that a new world is emerging and that money and status are being determined through profession, not necessarily through birthright. What the Elliot family decides to do to save appearances and also to save money is to vacation in Bath, Bath being a very common vacation spot. It was known for its healing springs. And then Anne, who's not really given much respect in the family, that might say something about the role, oftentimes, of middle children in families. She's going to stay behind with her sister, Mary Musgrove, as the others vacation in Bath. And of course, the Admiral and Mrs. Croft will rent Kellynch Hall. And then ultimately, what they will be able to do is to introduce the character of Wentworth. The Musgrove family is very different than the Elliot family. So what Anne finds out about her in-laws is they have hobbies and interests, and they allow their daughters to court and marry of their own free will, and they don't dictate whom their daughters should marry. And as the Musgrove family spends more time with Anne, and Anne spends more time with the Musgrove family, they begin to rely more on her and appreciate her abilities the way her own birth family doesn't. And because of that, in part, Anne recaptures her bloom. The idea of the importance of physical appearance as it mirrors emotional satisfaction. We find out, which seems to be a very minor incident, but again, there isn't going to be a lot of action in this text, certainly not in the way that we will see with Jane Eyre. Little Charles Musgrove, the child of the Musgroves, he falls and dislocates his collarbone. There is a theme in this novel of falling, whether characters are falling, because in the next volume, volume 2, we've got a character who falls off the wall, but also the falling of status and the falling of social expectations as well. And neither parent, it turns out, wants to care for little Charles. The father saying that it's not his responsibility, and the mother saying that it's not fair that she should be left with such a responsibility. Both of them want to meet the new person in town, who happens to be Wentworth, who's bringing a lot of excitement with him. So Anne stays and takes care of the child as they all visit Frederick Wentworth, and Anne stays behind, and she's grateful at that point because she has a past history with Frederick, which we find out about as the novel unfolds. The Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who are renting Kellynch Hall, note they have no children, and they married for love. This is a rather modern, contemporary relationship compared to the unions that were expected during this time period. And they talked about that the worst thing that can happen in marriage is a long separation. The idea is that they get emotional fulfillment from one another. They're not married for status, money, or for making children, in effect. Of course, the major excitement that happens is that Wentworth has friends that he can introduce to the Elliots, and also he can introduce to the Musgroves. His friends, the Harvilles, live in an adjoining town, Lyme. And the Harvilles are similar to the Musgroves in that they don't necessarily have status, but they have hobbies and interests, and they are much more self-sufficient and much less pretentious. And then the first novel ends with Louisa, whom Wentworth is courting at this point, falling off of a wall. Again, that idea of falling. She's so impulsive. And again, Wentworth is attracted to her strong will. But this goes to show what happens when your will is too strong and you engage in foolhardy activities, that danger and difficulty can result. So again, the message embedded within the novel is about a certain level of restraint, a certain level of moderation, a certain level of balance. You want to avoid the extremes of too much restraint, but not enough restraint. When we get to volume 2, we return to Sir Walter. If you'll remember, this is how volume 1 began. And this is where William Elliot, Mr. William Elliot, the heir presumptive, returns back to the family circle. We see that Anne, because she's been spending so much time with the Musgroves and with Wentworth and Wentworth's friends, she's going out in the world, she's meeting new people, she's beginning to be appreciated, and her bloom is coming back to her. And at this point, Captain Benwick, Mr. Elliot, and Frederick Wentworth are all interested in Anne at this point, because she shows such a superior quality of intellect and reason and rationality that really isn't seen with other women. Plus, she also has her bloom, her physical appearance. And of course, Captain Benwick is mourning the loss of his fiancée, so when would be the time for him? Mr. Elliot is the heir presumptive, so if he were to marry Anne, that would give him the ability to basically have the family estate. And Frederick Wentworth who at once had a relationship with Anne and realizes that Louisa, while she might seem attractive for being very strong-willed, that also comes with negatives as well as positives. We're introduced to the Viscountess Dalrymple, which is superior, or who is superior in status to Sir Walter. So we see it is possible to humble Sir Walter. And Mr. Elliot and Sir Walter are both trying to impress the Viscountess. And of course, Anne is horrified by the whole thing, that they would be um, so concerned with status. In fact, quote, Anne was ashamed of her family, preferring the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation rather than birth, education, and manners. These long, classical, long-winded sentences are supposed to mimic the pace of the lifestyle of this privileged class. This is where we're introduced also to Anne's former classmate, Mrs. Smith, who now is a widow and is also destitute. She's a poor, infirm, helpless widow living in Westgate Buildings. The idea is that this is rather the unsavory part of town, yet Anne maintains proudly her relationship with Mrs. Smith. And Anne is also human, so even though she does push back against many of the expectations of her social circle, she also experiences temptation, and she's thinking about what it would mean to marry William Elliot. Part of that would mean that Anne could keep her surname, and she would maintain her surname of Elliot and become a Lady Elliot of Kelnich Hall. But she resists doing this because while William Elliot was rational, discreet, and polished, he was not open. And what she's really looking for is character. It turns out that of all people, Captain Benwick and Louisa are going to be married. After Louisa fell off the wall, she spent a good amount of time with Captain Benwick and with the Harvilles, and ultimately it turns out that proximity breeds perhaps romantic attraction. Benwick and Louisa being very different from one another. And again, the idea is that they will both meet in the middle and compromise, again, about moderation. Here, Captain Benwick is rather moody, reads too much poetry, rather melancholy. Louisa is too free and spirited and independent. And that, again, the both of them will probably play off of one another so that they meet someplace in the middle. And then, of course, Wentworth realizes that he does have an opportunity to perhaps be with Anne, despite all of the years that have gone by, because she still has an interest in him. And Wentworth talks about how horrified he is that someone could lose their fiancé and shortly thereafter show interest in another woman, saying that a man does not recover from such a devotion to the heart to such a woman. He ought not. He does not. So in other words, Wentworth is saying that he has a very different kind of character. He's much more steadfast than Benwick could ever be. And of course, Anne is listening to all of this as well and realizing that she might have an opportunity with Wentworth. Mrs. Smith, of course, there are questions about her motivation. She ends up becoming friends, it turns out, as we get backstory, with Mr. Elliot, who brought her deceased husband to financial ruin. So this is the reason why Mrs. Smith is destitute. And not only that, but Mr. Elliot is such a scoundrel, he refuses to help her secure her small inheritance of property. And the evidence of this is in letters. We talked a little bit about Frankenstein in the epistolary novel. It sort of reminds me of that. We do find out that Henrietta and Charles Hayter, after some back and forth, are going to marry. And of course, because he represents the church, then even though that's not necessarily going to be a financially beneficial union, it will be a spiritually beneficial union. So therefore, her family approves. And Mrs. Croft says quite tellingly, I'd rather have young people settle on a small income at once and have to struggle with a few difficulties together than be involved in a long engagement. And of course, this is speaking to the idea of Anne not being able to commit to Wentworth because he hadn't established his financial worth yet. Anne says in a very telling statement, and this novel is different than Frankenstein. Notice how male-centric Frankenstein was. We had talked about the idea that that was a commentary by Shelley about what happens in a world which excludes female. Now we have Anne as serving as our female voice and says, quote, men have every advantage of us, she's speaking about women, in telling their own story. All the privilege I claim for my own sex is that of loving the longest when existence or when hope is gone. So not only are we establishing the loyalty of female, we're also establishing the importance of this author of persuasion, a female author being able to tell the story of female, which is quite uncommon at the time. And as the novels progress and the other reading progress, we'll see that they become much more progressive in terms of statement about gender. And Anne talks about, if I was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk. I was right in submitting to her. And basically, she's talking about Lady Russell. And that if I had done otherwise, I would have suffered more in continuing the engagement than I did even in giving it up, because I should have suffered in my conscience. So as progressive as this novel is, it's still rather conservative, and the idea that Anne doesn't necessarily regret her hesitation, saying that at that time and place, it was in everyone's best interest. But she certainly is grateful that she is in a different place now. And the plot twist is that of all people, Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot become a couple. And we know that both of them have had questionable characters, so it's not too surprising. And then our happy ending that Anne and Frederick Wentworth marry, and he's going to assist Mrs. Smith. So what we have is the happy ending to the romance novel. Now, the attendance question that I wanted to ask today wasn't necessarily about persuasion, but it could be about persuasion, because as I began today, I was talking about the first paper, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about what your thoughts might be about the first paper. So this will be due on Saturday, the 25th, and certainly if you need an extension, let me know, and I'll be happy to grant it to you. And you aren't required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to respond to your peers. What you are required to do, however, is to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And I'll be catching up on your discussion forum responses as well over the next several days. And the discussion forum question is, what do you think at this point? And you're not necessarily committed, but what do you think you would write about for paper number 1? And if so, what would you write about? So I've given you a sample topic, but I haven't necessarily identified what text or how you would pursue that topic in the text. So the question is, do you have an idea about some of the things that you would be writing about for paper 1? And if so, what is that idea? And again, you're not necessarily committed. You could certainly change your mind. But at this point, you should be thinking about whether you want to write about the story of an hour, or you want to write about Frankenstein, or if you want to write about persuasion and some of the ways that you could go about doing that. Now, we will revisit this idea next class, as well as Jane Eyre. And I can tell you right now that Jane Eyre is a very long book. You can see that in the 7th section in the notes below. I've indicated the link for you. So in my mind, you have finished reading Persuasion, though we might have a few summary comments left for Persuasion next class. And you are in the midst of reading Jane Eyre. And as you know, while we have sometimes multiple classes devoted to a text, what would be ideal is that you've read the text or close to it in its entirety as we begin talking about the text. But I know that might not be possible. The thing about Jane Eyre is that we can divide it up into sections. I like to divide Jane Eyre up into separate books. I think that makes the text much more accessible. And not only will I talk about this next class, but I think you'll find once you start Jane Eyre, if you haven't already started it, that it moves rather quickly. It's very differently written than Persuasion or even Frankenstein. This is a book where a lot of action occurs, and it also is a romance, but it also is a Gothic story. And we had talked about Gothic a little bit with Frankenstein, so we will be revisiting that when we get to Jane Eyre. And it is an incredibly progressive book based on what we have read thus far. in the class. And instead of getting somebody from a privileged class, we find out that Jane is poor and plain. And that means that she doesn't have the opportunities that many other females have had that we've read about thus far. So, but again, I don't want to talk too much about Jane Eyre until next week, where we will also put some closure onto Persuasion. I hope you're doing well. I am doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about, well, Jane Eyre. Take care. Bye bye.